Hello, John.
Hey George, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm fine. We've got a kind of pre-spring day here. It's warm and sunny after lots of winter recently. So yeah, I've got a little bit of spring fever.
Oh, well, that's good. But isn't it supposed to snow?
Not as far as I know. It snowed a couple of nights ago, and we got this big storm, of course, exactly a week ago. Dumped a whole bunch of snow on New York City, and especially up in Massachusetts, I guess. They really got hammered.
Oh, God, I know. Yeah, was it like 36 to 48 inches in places?
Yeah, a lot of people lost power, but it was not that big a deal down here.
Yeah, it's been cold and clear here with, little snows, but we're not getting nearly enough water for what we should be getting.
Enough water?
Yeah, from snow. The snow melt isn't really going to be good, and our water supply is like close to half dependent on that, so not good.
Well, George, you've got some news to report. That's very important.
Very important news. Oh, you must be referring to my new blog on the Discover Magazine website. Yeah, I just started. I did the first post on, was that Tuesday? Anyway, earlier in the week. So the name of the blog is called Fire in the Mind, and it's named after my book, Fire in the Mind, Science, Faith, and the Search for Order. So, I just was kind of picked that as a title that I could use sort of, as a reason to write about pretty much, anything that seemed interesting in the, in the science news and get at some of the deep questions that we always like to talk about on blogging heads, the nature of knowledge and all of that.
The nature of knowledge, I'm putting up scare quotes. The nature of truth. More scare quotes. I was thinking about your book, let's see, I guess it was yesterday, because in this humanities survey course that I teach, we've got literature and philosophy and history and political science, and in the philosophy section, we have the first reading is Plato, the Allegory of the Cave and the Apology of Socrates, and the second one is Francis Bacon, and this essay he has on the four idols, and which are these ways in which we deceive ourselves, all these problems that we have as human beings, as animals that take in our information through our senses and have these peculiarities just as a result of our physiology, and then other distortions created by our personal life experiences, distortions that result from culture and all these dogmas, received wisdom that tell us how the world works that are probably false. And the question is, how the fuck do we know anything at all? All these problems.
And Francis Bacon was worrying about that.
Yeah, Francis Bacon.
the original scientific empiricist.
Yeah, 500 years ago. And he was so sophisticated. There's so much Thomas Kuhn already in Francis Bacon.
Really?
He talks a lot about
I hadn't appreciated that.
Oh yeah, he's an amazingly modern thinker about the pitfalls of science and of basically all modes of knowledge. And he's got, he reminds me of Kuhn when he talks about the problems of language and how we create these labels for things, categories, and we have these words to describe things out there in the world that may not actually exist.
Yeah. It's part of that drive that that was one of my big obsessions in Fire in the Mind, the book, and I mentioned it in my first post in the blog, that basically the brain is endowed with this wonderful ability to find order in the swirl of sensory impressions and the chaos around us, and yet we're cursed with never being able to know for sure if the orders we find are really out there or if they're imposed by the mind. And sometimes it seems more obvious than other times. When you really get out onto the edge of what it seems possible for us Earthlings to understand about the universe, then really, really becomes interesting. Like talking about, superstrings, for example, and things that resist any attempt to pose an experiment that would say, yay or nay, or, well, never yay or nay, but they might say yay for a while until we can come up with a better experiment, and then you start running into the whole black swan problem again. And yet, for all that, we've managed to put together, a pretty good picture of the way the universe, at least in our little corner, works, and we can make these amazing predictions. We can predict the coming of asteroids.
Yeah.
We can, predict when comets will return, and so it's interesting.
Yeah, and I don't know. It's just it's funny. I sort of feel like, I'm not a postmodernist.
No, far from it.
I'm not a postmodernist. I think that to the degree that you are, I think that we do get some things right, but I have become more aware lately of how much knowledge that for a while we take for granted actually is really shaky, that its underpinnings are filled with all sorts of cracks. And, that happens even when our intentions are pure, but then you've got the whole problem of impure intentions. Well,
what's a good example of that?
Well, I have just read a couple of really blockbuster articles recently, both published in Scientific American, big feature articles. One is by Charles Seif. Do you know him?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah, has he been out to your workshop?
No, he hasn't. Yeah, we should invite him.
Yeah,
he's teaching. Is he teaching at NYU or Columbia?
He is teaching he's in the NYU graduate program in science journalism.
Yeah, right. And he wrote a book about zero, and
he's really a physics guy.
There was another one. Yeah, I follow him on Twitter.
Well, he wrote a book about fusion. I brought him out to Stevens.
Fusion, that's
about
right.
That a couple of years ago.
Right.
And
He's really
as you see, and he wrote a book about zero. I think he's written about, the attempt of physicists to understand nothing, understand the vacuum.
Right.
But this new article was it was, maybe he's been doing this kind of thing for a while, but if he was, I'm not aware of it. It was a really hard-hitting investigation of how the whole process of evaluating medical treatments, drugs,
I did read
procedures,
that.
and everything is completely corrupt, is fucked up from top to bottom. It's not just the drug companies. It's also all the governmental agencies, the FDA, the National Institutes of Health, that have these structural flaws that perpetuate certain distortions in the way that we get that the public gets information about the pros and cons of medicine,
right?
Of drugs and so forth.
Yeah, he did that as part of like a class, right? So he had all this reporting power, and
that's right. And it looks like it took a long time. Freedom of information requests and so forth, and really putting a spot. I'm always hammering on big pharma, and but what Charles made me realize is that a big part of the problem is these federal agencies as well. And of course, it shouldn't be that surprising because you get a lot of people going through the revolving door from companies.
Anything like that. But so he's talking about under-regulation. Yeah.
Yes, under-regulation, and how you'd think that these federal agencies, whose job is basically to protect the public, would be really sensitive to this, but they're at least what I took from Charles's article, they're really stonewalling and very resistant to any scrutiny or any suggestion that there should be reform. So that's one article, and I really admire Scientific American for doing this because I'm sure they were getting huge blowback. They just published another article I just saw this morning by a British doctor named Ben.
Oh, Ben Goldacre, sure. He has that new book.
Yeah.
Called Big.
Right.
Is it called Big Pharma?
It's called.
Yeah, that's not it.
Yeah. Well,
but
anyway,
it made a huch splash in the UK, and as did his previous book, just called Bad Science. Right.
Right. So this new one, it's it's looking at the same territory that Scythe is, and basically what Goldacre has uncovered and has lots of data on it. It's not just cherry picking and anecdotal reporting on the sins of certain companies. He shows that it's really systemic, that companies do all these clinical trials of various kinds of drugs, and then they decide what to publish.
That's been a huge problem because that many. So if a trial shows that a drug has some effect, and often it's a very slight one above the placebo effect. That's what those get published, and then the negative results never appear.
Yeah, and he's got and what he says is what's remarkable about this is that not only is it very difficult or impossible for journalists or individual doctors like Goldacre to get a hold of unpublished data that bears on the safety and efficacy of certain drugs. Even the governmental organizations that are trying to make decisions about what sorts of drugs and procedures to pay for in government programs. So this is true. For example, Goldacre is looking at the National Health Service in England. These federal regulators, they can't get their hands on the data, which is extraordinary because we're paying out just billions and trillions of dollars for these things, and we're relying on the pharmaceutical industry and other medical companies to supply us with accurate data, and they're not.
Yeah.
And you're right that we've been aware of this problem for a while, but it just seems that people kind of throw up their hands. Nothing really gets done about it. And Goldacre has some specific examples. He says this even affects clinical trials themselves. He has at least one example of a trial of a supposedly novel drug that turned out to be deadly. A significant number of people died in the trial because they had heart attacks. And then it turned out, and then Goldacre found out that actually there had been a much earlier trial, essentially of the same drug, that had shown that it was extremely dangerous. But that trial had never been published.
So that might have headed off any desire to even try another trial, or at least to take more safeguards. Yeah, I'm going to have to read that because it's not. It's not something I have direct familiarity with, except for just the general complaints about the clinical trial process and the lack of publication of data, and then just the whole drive to change a few molecules or a few atoms, atomic links in a small molecule drug, like a targeted therapy in cancer, and come up with your own version of a certain, kind of inhibitor to inhibit a certain, growth receptor in a cell, and then, proving that it's seems to have some effect in, in vitro, and then in mice, which is another whole huge problem, and then getting to the point of, proving that it's at least reasonably safe and efficacious in people, and then actually comparing it against an alternate therapy, and then seeing if there's really, increased survival time, and then often you're showing that the survival time at best might be, an additional three months of life. This is for like a, stage 4 advanced metastatic cancer, and then, once you get that, you can market it and, make, quite a bit of money, or at least you can charge quite a bit of money, to patients that are in this impossible position of, wanting to add a few months to their life and thinking that this will give them the edge until maybe something else is found. And I say that they're making huge amounts of money. They're charging huge amounts of money, but then, of course, these clinical trials are extremely expensive, as is the rest of the drug research. And I really want to read this book because it's just a whole.
Well. Here's how it's. Unfortunately, these exposés. I've focused on these problems in psychiatry and drugs for mental illness, but I realize it's much more pervasive than that, and it's really affecting how I see medicine as a whole. So, did you see the article in the New Yorker? It was a profile of Dr. Oz.
Yes, right, by Michael Spector. That's funny. Yeah, I did see that. It's interesting because I always keep hearing people keep telling me, God, when your cancer book comes out, so my book is coming out in August. They're saying, oh God, if you could get on the Dr. Oz show, that would be it. You'd be golden. You'd be, that you'd get the ultimate publicity. And then, so I vaguely knew that there was this kind of Oprah creation, this Dr. Oz, and he had a medical show, and I knew it was huge, but I hadn't realized some of the rather sketchy things that he had been doing lately, like performing his own clinical trial, essentially, on television with a studio audience for some kind of really hokey-sounding fat-burning remedy.
Yeah, and he's peddling stuff with names like, I don't know, red palm oil for God knows what. It really sounds like snake oil.
And then green tea extract, and I'm sure now we'll hear from people who swear by green coffee beans. That's what it was, green coffee beans. I think that's what he.
Here's how I just want to tell you why I ended up feeling sort of ambivalent about that article. I thought it was a brilliant piece of classic science journalism. You look at this person who is having a huge impact on how people take care of their health in this country, all right? It's a show that's watched by millions. He is, as I recall, Harvard educated. He works at Columbia Presbyterian. He's a heart surgeon, so he's got all the kind of blue chip credentials, and he's obviously a brilliant guy.
Yeah, he's not just some quack, and yet he's...
Yeah. But then he's peddling, or he's very credulous toward alternative medicine, and it turns out that that's because, his wife is into a lot of this stuff. And I thought, okay, that's, my initial reaction was, that's bad. I'm glad this person was exposed because now we realize that he's kind of flaky and maybe he's benefiting in certain unethical ways by preying on the gullibility of people and his own prestige. And then I see these articles. The Sype article is it's titled "How Drug Company Money is Undermining Science." You've got that. Then you've got the Goldacre article. So how do you can't just have the easy knee-jerk reaction against the flakiness and the untestedness of alternative medicine when you know that mainstream medicine is so fucked up and so rotten to the core.
And yet
that's the dilemma.
Mainstream medicine has made some huge advances that are So I don't know that you could go from A to Z like that.
Yeah, I know. I try to resist, but like I said, if you're just some schmuck consumer out there, you've got high blood pressure, you've got, you've got maybe you're at the age where you have to start worrying about prostate cancer, breast cancer, and these sorts of things, and then you realize that a lot of what you are being told by your doctor and the drugs that are being recommended for you might be based on really flimsy evidence.
Yeah, well, it depends on the drug, too. I mean, there's a lot of really, very efficacious pharmaceutical treatments for blood pressure, which
That's true.
A personal anecdote, but I know just finding, for me, for some reason, I seem to have what they call essential hypertension, which it's essential in the sense that it's part of your essence, and they can't really explain, what it is that, that causes you to have high blood pressure. You specifically, since there's several different mechanisms that can kind of intertwine, and you get this right, you find the right combination of medications, and you really can control it. I mean, there's a certain amount of controversy over just how much it needs to be controlled at the current levels. They keep lowering the bar, but there's case after case where the system works.
Yeah, you see my dilemma.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but then you can't just reject mainstream medicine and say, well, these natural cures may not be any worse, and because most of them are not tested in any kind of rigorous.
That's true. It's just that a lot of alternative medicine is, I would say, it's sort of harmless. You're exploiting the placebo effect.
Well, a lot of it, but not necessarily. I mean, there's some dangerous supplements out there. There's actually a really good piece in Slate. Well, first there was an article in the New York Times Sunday magazine. It was about a woman whose child had some, really horrible kind of congenital arthritis, and did you read that?
Yeah, I remember that. Right.
And it was the article was kind of controversial because it was there was another article that followed it in Slate that was it was actually written by a woman, Michelle Frankel, who was a student at the Santa Fe Science Writing Workshop a few years ago, and I thought, oh, and she's a chemist, and she wrote this, really interesting takedown comparing. So the woman with the son with arthritis was worried about the horrible side effects of this medication that was being prescribed to treat her son, and then she heard about this alternative therapy, and decided to try it. And but she did it very responsibly, I think. She didn't decide to stop the conventional treatment, but she conferred with her doctor and asked if he thought there was any harm in trying them both. And then she tried them both, and then her son got better, and he hadn't been getting better, it seemed, on the conventional medication. And yet there were all these ambiguities because this was a arthritis for which there were often spontaneous remissions, and they sometimes didn't always last that long, and there was some indication just in folk medicine that this alternative treatment worked and some that it didn't. But the thing that was nice in Slate was just taking the chemical formula of the pharmaceutical medicine and the chemical formula of the one that had this very Chinese herbal concoction soothing kind of name, and showing that they are both obviously chemicals, with these complex structures, and that you were really deciding to take this compound on the left instead of this compound on the right. And plus, you made the case that there were serious side effects that could come from the nice Chinese herbal medicine compound with the touchy-feely name. But then there was kind of a backlash against the Slate article because it felt like it was being too harsh on the New York Times article, because that woman really ended with this sense of ambiguity that I admired. That she said she didn't really know that the herbal concoction worked. Maybe it had been a big mistake, but it seemed to work for now. There still could be a reversion to the disease, and but it was just kind of a nice portrait of the uncertainties a parent goes through in deciding these things. That's why it's a really good article. So I don't think it deserved to
That's why
takedown. But the takedown was good as far as a general critique of this comparison between conventional and folk medicine.
Yeah. So the Times Magazine article, what I thought was brilliant about it was that it brought in the whole sort of emotional dimension. And you remember that there was this fairly tense standoff between the mother who's telling the story and her husband, who's got a very different view of what they should do. And what was really poignant about it was that she was very honest in talking about how she is agonizing over what to do. And the problem is that there is not good guidance in a situation like this. And also what I'm saying, my point here is that there are very good reasons to distrust what your doctor is telling you at this point about the best course.
To look skeptically and do some of your own research. But I mean, I don't know. I just happen to have a really good doctor that really lays out things in a way that really emphasizes how little we really know.
Well, and it's not to say that the alternative medicine industry isn't filled with charlatans.
That's the thing. I mean,
well. And you're right when you're, again, something that some of these diseases, in fact, all diseases pretty much, the course can be so complicated. There are spontaneous remissions of even really deadly diseases and people popping out of comas and every now and then someone will survive advanced pancreatic cancer, and maybe they have just tried some kind of bizarre macrobiotic diet. And
there's just too many variables. I mean, as with in anything, in any kind of scientific experiment, but particularly when you're dealing, with medical science and the human body and just controlling the different variables and actually getting, like when you're doing the double-blind study and just controlling for possible unappreciated biases, and it's definitely a hard. It's never going to be clear cut, these things. There's going to be some drugs occasionally that just have these really profound effects, and yet it still could be that they're having these subtle side effects that don't crop up for years, and it's just not clear how you. And then here I just probably sounded distracted because I was looking for this Slate article. The headline was, this is interesting because on my second post in my Discover blog, I was writing about this general rule that whenever you see a story that has a rhetorical question for a headline, you can just assume that the answer is no, and then move on. And I was giving the example of that story that I think we might have talked about before, called "Does a Jellyfish Hold the Secret to Immortality?" Of course a jellyfish doesn't hold the secret to immortality. But anyway, I was just noticing on the Slate story, here's another interesting kind of headline. The headline is, "Don't take medical advice from the New York Times Magazine." So that's kind of that would be an imperative sentence, right? I mean, it's practically a command. And then this is the article.
I would be even less likely to take medical advice from a Slate.
Well, this one's good, even though I think it was overly harsh. I mean, it was harsh when it shouldn't have been on the New York Times Magazine writer and her situation. But on the other hand, it makes some excellent, just really brilliant points about the illusion of the harmlessness of alternative medicine. So basically, this is the part that I really like. The story says, the reality is this. Meadows, who's the woman who wrote the Times article, has been tricked by language, maliciously or not, into considering switching her child from a carefully measured weekly dose of this molecule, and then she has a picture of the molecule with all the carbon and nitrogen and hydroxyl groups, and then to 4 doses of an unknown amount of this chemical, and then she shows its chemical formula. And then it says, really? And the first drug, the pharmaceutical drug is, let's see, what is it called? If I knew we were going to talk about this, I would have looked it up. But let's see. Well, anyway, it has this very forbidding sounding, techie kind of name. And then the Chinese herbal medicine is called, let's see. Yeah, you know what I'm saying. Okay, here we go. It was, the rheumatologist had prescribed methotrexate was the name, which sounds kind of harsh and scary and sharp-edged, and the Chinese medicine was called, oh God, I wish I could find this. This is so frustrating.
I know, but that's way
I'm
too
not sure. But then the good line that I'm kind of blowing because I don't have the background here, but it leads to this punchline. Like, would the woman have felt better if instead of being told that that she was getting methotrexate, that she was getting something called spirits of feathers or extract of willow, and she shows that these two drugs that she was getting could be described this way because that's where they originally derived from. But no, I didn't think it was a cheap shot. I think it, for most people who consider taking these, really, these nice, comfy sounding herbal formulas. It's called Four Marvels powder. That was it. Four Marvels powder was the name of the Chinese medicine. And then she's showing, what it really is. But, so I can see that for a lot of people making this decision, that was a very incisive, criticism. They probably, really were overly influenced by this name and not really thinking that everything's a chemical. Well, it's a good article, so.
The mother.
No, she did. That's what I just said. I mean, what I meant to say that I don't think she personally deserved that criticism, but the article in Slate making the more general point that this is what people do, I thought was very good. So I thought both articles were very good, although for very different reasons.
Well, so should we talk a little bit about the Fire in the Mind was about these deep philosophical and even theological questions that we're trying to answer often through science and not necessarily these more practical life and death issues.
Right, the important stuff. I wasn't expecting that we were going to talk about anything about Big Pharma or either of these articles, so I didn't really reread them and get them in my mind. But what I would like to talk about is, really, while I was writing the first two posts of the Fire in the Mind blog, I was also rereading this book review you wrote of Thomas Nagel's book, and then you republished it on Crosscheck, your Scientific American blog, and that just raised all kinds of interesting questions. So the title of the book is and then the subtitle it's something like Why Scientific Materialism is Almost Certainly Wrong.
Yeah, let me see. I'm just looking for. Oh, here it is. Yeah. Why the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost
right. So he's
false.
talking about scientific materialism. But he, just to tweak even more noses, he's emphasizing neo-Darwinism.
Yeah. So
no, I just read the reviews, right? and so just based on what I know about the book, which a lot of it's from that nice review you had in the Toronto Globe and Mail. Is that where it was?
Right.
What does it mean to say that scientific materialism is almost certainly wrong? Obviously it's not, but as far as giving us answers to questions and the ability to predict and to give us a real foothold in understanding the world. But is he saying that on a deeper level, as far as like taking this as the ultimate answer to everything, that it can't explain the entire universe, in which I would agree?
Yeah. So here's what seems to be his main problem. So you've got this these theories that together provide a fairly good account of the universe as this kind of gigantic physical structure that seems to have had an origin maybe 14 billion years ago, and we have a sort of fuzzy understanding of how the Big Bang happened and how galaxies formed and so forth, and then how our little solar system was formed, and then you had life emerging, and then conscious life and life capable of making distinctions between is and ought, emergence of morality and all this shit. And Nagel's problem seems to be that if you that basically what science really does is, the sort of materialist science, as he puts it, is describe the workings of this physical universe, but there is no suggestion in the laws of physics of why it should be that life would emerge eventually in this one little tiny corner of the universe. And why, once life emerged, at some point you should get life capable of subjective awareness and of saying that certain things have value and other things not so much value, and this strange way of thinking about reality that we call morality. Where the fuck did that come from? And Nagel, I think, wants somehow embedded in the basic laws of physics plus, I guess, Darwinian theory, there to be the seeds of all these amazing traits that we have, that we
but you can imagine, even though we don't know what they are in every case, you can certainly imagine answers that would come out of the scientific materialistic Darwinist framework. I mean, not just the laws of physics, but the laws of physics combined with the accidents and contingencies of evolution and a lot of randomness in an infinite universe. For something like life to appear at least in one place, which is the only place we found it, but probably more, but at least in one place doesn't seem extraordinary to me at all, just as a pure fluke. And that once it did, that it would evolve and become better adapted, and that and would develop something like a brain for pattern recognition. And then that next step is the hardest one, where the brain would be able to basically form a model or map of itself, just as it forms of other people, and trying to predict what they'll do, and that this would somehow lead to what Douglas Hofstadter calls a strange loop, where we have the sense of being and consciousness. And that is one of those things that you look at it from one angle and it seems extremely spooky, and on another angle and it seems like maybe not so spooky, and something that would just happen on an adequately complex self-referential system.
Well, Nagel seems he just does not accept the whole. You start with the premise of these this set of particles plus this set of forces acting on those particles, and then crazy shit happens. And a lot of it is, as you say, it's a fluke. It's random. If you have a big enough universe and enough time, then it's not that big a deal to expect life to emerge. After billions of years of life evolving in all sorts of different ways, not that big a deal maybe to expect that life like ours would emerge. And what's weird about Nagel is that he doesn't buy that coincidence explanation, and he's an atheist.
He's not doing
most
this
people who and he even what's really interesting about his view is that he talks about he thinks we maybe need to reintroduce teleology into science, and that somehow you have to have a new physics that has within it this kind of Aristotelian, because Aristotle was very teleological, notion of there being a kind of ultimate
right. So the
purpose
universe
to
is evolving and to develop consciousness and these reflective beings, and this is all in the cards from the beginning, and it's meant to be, but not in a religious sense, but because of some kind of teleological physics. So the result is that we end up getting creatures remarkably like ourselves to wonder, how this happened. And yeah, but that just seems
right.
I don't know. I guess I can see how somebody could believe that, but then why not believe? It's like take more of the Stephen Jay Gould view that some little jot or twiddle, in the evolutionary tree way back in the moments after the Cambrian explosion could have led to, some entirely different kind of creature that might or might not be conscious. And if it wasn't conscious, this wouldn't be an issue because it wouldn't have science and wouldn't be trying to explain these things. It wouldn't have philosophy. And if it did lead to some extremely different kind of creature with, the ability to do pattern matching and to develop patterns so complex that it had a sense of itself, and then it would be coming up with teleological reasons that would produce that kind of creature instead of the very human-like creature. So, but maybe that's not what Nagel. But maybe Nagel means that it wouldn't necessarily have to be human-like in the sense of bipeds that are structured just like us, but some kind of conscious being.
Conscious.
Well,
and
moral, but
and
that's
a big. That he wants somehow morality. Morality to be built in from the start too. And what disappointed me a little bit about his book is that I think he's been talking to and reading a lot of the intelligent design people and their literature. And, he rejects their explanation for things, but he accepts their critique of materialism and evolutionary theory. What disappoints me about Nagel, and I pointed this out in my my review of him, is that there are a lot of other people, scientists, who have had the same issues that he has with basic materialism and have proposed these kinds of add-ons to our basic scientific worldview. So you've got, the things that come to mind that I mentioned are John Wheeler, this fantastically imaginative, brilliant physicist, thought that somehow consciousness was a fundamental feature of reality. That was the implication of his it from bit idea. And Stu Kaufman so well. Stu also. He was worried about some of the same issues about the kind of arbitrariness of the emergence
and whether there's some kind of force of nature, a fourth law of thermodynamics that would encourage complexity to arise in the universe. Others will say that you can do that just with the laws of thermodynamics that you have, because as long as you're providing energy into a system, it doesn't have to be entropic. It can, become increasingly complex, even though in the long, long run, it'll be smashed down by the entropic tides. And I guess what I keep coming back to is, so if you have this completely, this mix of randomness, random generation and selection, the neo-Darwinian framework, and you have matter, energy, these physical laws. Then you get something that starts replicating, so that evolution and selection and all of that kicks in. Then it's going to develop and veer off in some way. And then at the end of the tip of one of this branch, if you happen to get beings who are conscious and can think about this, they will be absolutely marvel that this happened and believe that it couldn't possibly be any way else, and therefore we have to have a law saying why this had to happen. And yet on all of these other tips where it didn't lead to a conscious being, it's a non-issue. And in an infinite universe with all these billions of years for this process to unfold, maybe it just happened in one place here on the Earth, which is extremely unlikely, it seems, but even if it did, why not? And, it's miraculous to us because we're at the end of the tip. But Yeah,
should
yeah. So
happen.
I don't know. I just that doesn't bother me, but it's interesting. It sounds like an interesting book.
It occurs to me. I was just looking at Nagel's book to see if he mentioned the anthropic principle, and I don't think he did. It's not in his index, and the anthropic principle is a teleological idea.
Well, yeah, there's weak and strong versions.
But it's basically the kind of thing that Nagel is talking about. I mean, I actually addressed this in the End of Science. My feeling is that modern science, it's done a fabulous job within these certain boundaries of explaining the physical structure of the universe and giving us a pretty good history of the universe and explaining how life works and heredity and we're starting to get kind of a vague grasp of how the brain works and produces various mental states. But there are these huge questions that are outstanding, like where did the universe come from in the first place? And so my feeling is that we might have to accept that, and Nagel just rejects this, but we might have to accept that we're asking too much of science to answer some of these really deep sort of traditional.
Well, I mean that's always been one of my big themes, that we're part of the system we're trying to explain, and we can't step out of the universe, like the Archimedean point outside of the universe and look at it without us in it as a whole, and then explain it objectively and talk about where it came from and why it's there. These are all questions that are really beyond the ability of the system itself, which is science is within the universe, to explain. And there's going to be these edges. You cannot say why there is something instead of nothing. When people try to do it, like with Lawrence Krauss's recent book, which we've talked about, and putting it down to variations in field theory and the vacuum, randomly putting out particles and that's all very interesting, but you still end up coming down to a floor below that where you have to explain, why we have these field laws, and then a floor below that where you have to explain why we have mathematics. So, we hear that the Big Bang created space and time, whatever that means, and so they created the arena in which the matter and energy expand and obey these mathematical laws. But where are the laws? Are the laws located outside the universe? In which case you're talking about a Platonic kind of mysticism, and you're getting into religion very quickly, or at least mysticism if you see a difference. Or the laws in mathematics were created at the moment of the Big Bang along with space, time, mass, and energy. What the hell would that mean? That's just the edge that I always come up against, and I don't think it's possible, in principle, to ever explain that. And that leaves room for people to arbitrarily decide to believe A, B, or C, and those being the world's so-called three great religions.
Well, I still love seeing powerful minds beating against these ancient problems. That's why I love something like the It from Bit. I think ultimately it's more maybe like poetry than science, but it's beautiful, and it's like this wonderful poignant failure. It can't explain the riddle, but in trying to solve it, it comes up with something strange and interesting. So, we're never going to stop trying to figure out the solution to these problems. I do want to point out, though, that, I just mentioned my book, The End of Science. I wrote something that's kind of related to the Nagel book that came out right after I posted on Scientific American about it. And the title is The End of Science Bandwagon is Getting Crowded. Now, so this is related to the annual question of John Brockman. He's got this website, The Edge. Brockman is the science book agent, and he's got a lot of famous clients and not so famous clients. I used to be represented by Brockman, and his question this year is, what
yeah, it was a great
about?
question. I felt really tempted to chime in, but like occasionally I've chimed in on those annual questions, and you have too. Probably more often.
Yes.
Yeah, I haven't either.
I
don't know. I just didn't feel like I had anything profound to say, and I knew I could read a lot of profound things from others. So.
Well, so one thing that struck me, I always, every year I troll through it seeing if I can find something that I could blog about. And usually it's just kind of overwhelming.
But this was a particularly good one. And I read your post in Crosscheck, and I thought it was really interesting that you were pointing out that there were these physicists like Steve Giddings and Lisa Randall, who they were like my favorite sources when I used to write about superstrings and extra dimensions and all of that. And then you find them kind of expressing this sort of despair that we're up against this edge where we may know as much as we can. No, is that a fair representation of what they said?
There's slightly different versions of that. So I started the piece actually by mentioning that I surveyed my students on. We were talking about this piece. I'm actually teaching freshman composition, and I give my students a lot of. We have this textbook that has essays from a wide variety of authors, including a lot of modern science writers. And I gave them a piece by Michio Kaku on dark matter, and then I basically wanted to find out how much my students even give a shit about stuff like the Big Bang and dark matter, and where did the universe come from, and whether or not we should pay for this kind of research and how much we should pay. And I asked them if research on particle physics and cosmology should be supported by tax dollars if they wanted to pay for that, and almost all of them said no.
Right.
And
well, these were freshmen. God, these are just like little kids.
Yeah, and actually then I pulled a different class and I got a little more.
Yeah, I was glad to see the coda
science,
at the end where they didn't all think it was completely worthless if it didn't have practical applications.
Right, except that actually in that class most of them said there could always be practical applications. They refused to accept the premise that there's some science that might never have any kind of payoff or return on investment, as they put it. So there are some physicists who are worried about this issue of withdrawing support. Are we going to be able to go beyond the Large Hadron Collider, build an even bigger accelerator, to delve into smaller scales and higher energy ranges? Lisa Randall is worried about that basically society.
Oh, okay. So I really kind of mischaracterized what they were saying. And they're not saying that there's like fundamental reasons why we may be up against the edge of what it's possible for the human brain to know, but that society won't support these larger quests.
Some of them did say that. So these were the sorts of things, I addressed, in the End of Science, I addressed this problem of social support, economic limits, physical limits that you face in physics when you have to build these gigantic, very expensive instruments, but then also these more possibly absolute limits of going beyond the edge of the visible universe, the observable universe, and finding out what happened before the Big Bang, whether or not, even if you devoted your entire gross national product to try and investigate that question, maybe you would just never answer it. And same with strings, superstrings. That it looks right now like even if you built bigger and bigger accelerators, you would never get really good data to confirm some of these.
Oh, well, why does it seem like that?
And there are. Well, just because superstrings are supposedly inhabiting
scale, but if we did build an accelerator the size of the Milky Way, yeah, okay, so it's not.
Right.
But then there's all these arguments that you can do those experiments with the accelerators that already exist in the form of the universe, and you can make observations about extremely high energies and velocities that are occurring for reasons that have nothing to do with us wanting an experiment, and then be able to constrain your theories using that.
Yes. But another theme that came out, and I'm just looking at Krauss. He says there may be new limits looming on our ultimate ability to probe nature, made manifest because of the truly remarkable successes of physical theory and experiment in the last. And this is something also that I thought was this weird paradox of modern science, and especially physics, being a victim of its own success. You had this extraordinary progress, and that is pushed out to the edge of the universe, the edge of time, that we have a theory of the origin of the universe.
I know.
It's fucking amazing. And that we understand that matter is made of quarks and electrons and things like that, and we have a really good grasp of the basic laws, but in trying to top that, we have to push further and further against the boundaries of what's physically possible.
It's naturally going to get, probably exponentially more difficult.
Right. And so even Krauss, who's of course, a real cheerleader for scientific materialism, is worried about the future. And then there are also cognitive limits. There are a couple of interesting entries on mathematics where the mathematicians. This is something again. That's always interested me, and how modern mathematics has become so phenomenally complex that you have to be some kind of freak to really understand it. I mean, this is true of string theory too, and so it might be that we're reaching the boundaries of our cognitive limits. So mathematics might actually proceed in a kind of practical, applied way. You can compute certain results, but you won't necessarily have these insights and epiphanies that have been the main kind of aesthetic payoff.
Because that comes with finding things that are, once you find them, that they're simple and basic enough that you can kind of have this aha moment when it's all coming together.
Right.
Well, and then the brain up against its limits. It reminds me of one of my, favorite metaphors, about looking at ourselves in the scientific quest as being these fish inside this aquarium, and with our noses up against the glass, and we have no way of distinguishing whether the swirls and colors we see are something happening out there in the universe, or if it's a reflection of our own brains at some point.
Well, just to say that, just to have that idea, means that to a certain extent, we can get outside of the aquarium.
Well, that's where that metaphor breaks down, because the edge, and our aquarium is one where it's been defined as nothing is beyond the edge, or that it's nothing in the sense that the light could never reach us, and as the universe expands, so it's the unobservable universe. But then the even greater edge of whatever it was that was there, which is by definition nothing before the Big Bang.
Right, and then there's I'm thinking of, I just also taught Plato's cave, and then there's even, there's the cave of physical reality, but then there's also the cave of our own biases and expectations and assumptions.
Yeah, and again, if I can hark back to Fire in the Mind, one of my lines was, these brains that we have that evolved on Earth in order to eat and keep from being eaten, and it developed into these incredibly complex pattern recognition machines. I mean, there's no a priori reason why our mental abilities should be so vast that we should be able to understand the entire universe. And we're, just these little creatures on this one rock, around one star. And yet, it's amazing, given all that we've come up with what we have.
Unless the plan all along was for us to have these abilities so the universe could wake up to itself.
Yeah, God.
That's a phrase that Nagel has. We have to have a science that explains how the universe is waking up.
Yeah, and becoming aware of itself. This is starting to remind me of that, Frank Tipler's book, The Physics of Immortality.
Right.
Where eventually, it's basically this kind of built-in, wired-in destiny that the universe eventually becomes permeated with intelligence and consciousness, and just at the point where it starts collapsing after the ultimate expansion, and you get this increasing density of information, and at some point it turns into this computer with the ability to simulate everything that ever happened, in the past, every individual's experiences, and that this, what emerges from this is immortality and life everlasting. Amen.
Yeah, I once I talked to Tipler about, so basically it's this kind of scientific vision of heaven. And,
it's a cool book, and it
is a cool book. So I had these two contrasting pictures of what an infinitely powerful mind would do, and I asked Tipler, and he went on this thing, and I think there's some of this in his book about you could not only, like if you're a guy, you not only would have as a romantic partner the most beautiful woman who ever lived, you would have the most beautiful woman who was logically possible to simulate. And so, he was talking about supermodels, and, but like better than any supermodel in the world today. And so I was thinking, okay, that's interesting, a little cheesy somehow.
Yeah, that's kind of, you wouldn't think that, but Tipler.
But I kind of get it. And then I talked to Freeman Dyson, also had, he says that we're all going to turn into gas clouds.
Yeah.
And we're going to be super smart. This is after the Dyson spheres. And,
right.
And then, so a lot of what we do will be trying to come up with more efficient ways of conserving energy so we can live as the cosmos approaches heat death. And I said, okay, when we're not working on thermodynamics, what are we going to be thinking about? And the best he could come up with was math problems.
He apparently just recently solved, had a hand in solving some interesting result involving the traveling salesman problem.
Freeman Dyson?
Yeah. No, he's still going amazingly well. I heard from his son George Dyson. And,
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing.
What does the ultimate mind think? You really have a way of asking penetrating questions to these scientists, which is what I loved about the end of science. And I was really glad to read that people were starting to say some of the things that you were saying, because I think the book was widely misunderstood.
Thank you, George. I appreciate it.
I mean, you weren't saying that science was just going to stop. You were saying that that it's going to be less and less likely, and at some point, it's not going to happen, that we're going to have huge leaps on the order of the neo-Darwinian framework or the Big Bang Theory. And that every time there was some new science, like discovering that the universe is accelerating rather than simply expanding, people would say, I guess Horgan has egg on his face now, but that's not the kind of thing you were talking about. I mean, that all fits in and basically accommodates the Big Bang Theory.
Yeah, actually, that acceleration of the universe is by far the most exciting and potentially revolutionary thing that's happened since my book came out. And what's been disappointing is that it didn't, it's just dredged up the cosmological constant and dark energy.
Right, and all this stuff that we were, we as science writers were, basically told to, say didn't exist. And then suddenly it's like, oh God, finally we've proved the cosmological constant. And,
It would have been cool if it had pointed the way to something beyond the standard model or some completely new conception of a unified theory.
Yeah.
And maybe that'll still happen, and I swear to God, I hope it does happen.
Yeah, but it's getting... that's what's so... Yeah, of course, it's always unpredictable. That's one of the interesting ironies, like with the Higgs boson. The more and more they seem to be, narrowing it down and becoming increasingly sure that they found the Higgs boson that was predicted by the standard model or the standard model required. There's a sense of disappointment because the standard model in itself is not the ultimate unified theory because it still leaves loose ends even when you have a mechanism to explain where masses come from of different particles. And it would have been better if they found something else.
Yeah, they're being
like supersymmetric particles, for example, or extra dimensions. And
that would be cool.
Oh, that'd be great. And they don't know what energies these things, if they exist, are going to occur. And that's always been the dilemma. You can never, you can't, the usual. You can't prove a negative. So if these things are never found at the LHC, which I guess now is shutting down for 2 years for maintenance.
What? No, I didn't hear that.
Yeah, they have to clean.
Oh my God.
Yeah, but I think scheduled maintenance, and then it's apparently expected. I hope I have that right. But yeah,
I wonder Lisa Randall is depressed.
Oh, but and then if in 10 years they still haven't found these things, you can still say, well, they just exist at higher energies. That's what they kept doing at Fermilab, and of course that's a perfectly logical possibility.
Yeah.
So there's always going to be interesting stuff going on as long as people will pay for it, or as long as the world produces enough wealth that we can indulge in these things.
Yes, economics and particle physics.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of material there. George, I noticed we are at a minute in an hour and 8 minutes.
Oh God, yeah, I think we've overstayed our welcome here.
That's cool. We just had a lot to talk about.
Yeah, that was fun. Yeah, there was all kinds of things I would have liked to have gotten into that we didn't, but we'll do that in another approximately a month. We were a little late on our cycle this time for various reasons.
Not that anybody would notice.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's sitting there and marking it on their calendars, so...
Well, congratulations on your blog. I can't wait to...
Oh, well, thanks, and I'll put in a link to that, because I'd love to get more readers. I'm just in the point of acquiring some now, and I've no idea how that's going to work. But, I basically decided I'm going to give this a try for, I signed a contract to do it for a year and just see how it goes. It's very different from, what I usually do, so we'll see, especially from someone who used to describe himself as an anti-blogger, so...
Yeah, welcome to the blogosphere, and I'll send my humongous army of Twitter followers.
Oh, God, that'd be great, John. Yeah, I need all that I can get. I think I did pick up 10 this week, but yeah, it'll be fun to blog at each other.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
All right, George.
Okay.
All the best.
Yes, I will talk to you soon.